Hello, my name is Quentin Leclerc. I'm a final year PhD student at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and St. George's University of London. So this is a talk that I've given at the Microbiology Society Annual Conference in 2022 on the topic of interdisciplinary research in the field of antimicrobial resistance and a discussion of whether it really is the future of AMR science. My project personally focuses on combining mathematical modeling and lab work to study the dynamics of bacteria and bacteriophage, but I'll come back to this a bit later because first of all I want to start with some discussion on what is interdisciplinary research. And to me it's really about solving a problem by drawing from different areas and balancing strengths and weaknesses from different disciplines by combining them to answer questions which otherwise you would not be able to answer by using only single disciplines. So there's a couple of common misconceptions with interdisciplinary research that I want to dismiss straight away. So the first one is that it doesn't have to be a one-person effort. So I think it's very commonly thought that interdisciplinary research always involves these like one scientists who do all the work in the different disciplines, so who do all, again, as an example, all the modeling or all the lab work at the same time. And that's not true. You can actually have interdisciplinary projects where you have different individuals, each with their sort of own expertise, working together and communicating between each other to solve a problem together. And that still qualifies as interdisciplinary research. So kind of tied to this, the other two misconceptions is that doing interdisciplinary research does not mean knowing everything. So that's tied to that first point. Again, it doesn't have to be individuals only. So no one is expecting you to be a master of 10 different disciplines to do interdisciplinary research. This is not what it's about. Doing interdisciplinary research is about knowing how to combine disciplines, taking some aspects from different disciplines and bringing them together. So similarly, doing interdisciplinary research does not mean knowing nothing. So again, that's what some people might be afraid of is, oh, well, if I'm doing a bit of mathematical modeling and a bit of lab work, then actually I'm not an expert in any of these fields. That's a common struggle that can happen where people don't really feel confident, really don't feel that they know anything because they're just doing a bit of everything. And again, that's not true because if you do interdisciplinary research, then you have expertise in knowing how to combine these different fields together, and that's very valuable expertise. So what about AMR specifically then? Well, I think that AMR is definitely an interdisciplinary problem. So if you searched for antimicrobial resistance at the Microbiology Society Annual Conference, then you'd find 65 posters and 27 talks. So there's definitely a lot going on there. So these talks and posters, they range from genomic data analysis to wastewater sampling. So there's really a lot of different pieces of work going on in parallel. But the thing with AMR is that if you want to really answer these big AMR questions, then you need to understand many different aspects. So what I mean by this is, for example, if you want to answer the question of how did a patient become infected by an antibiotic resistant bacteria, then you could go down the road of thinking, well, maybe someone else infected that patient, so you're starting to look at transmission, so you're looking at some epidemiological elements there, or you could go down the route of thinking, well, maybe that patient has been exposed to antibiotics, so there's been some sort of within-host evolution going on, perhaps horizontal gene transfer, so this is going to be much more angled towards the microbiology aspect. So really, you see how you have to combine these different aspects to really be able to answer these questions from all the different angles. And the thing with AMR research is outputs from one discipline can really be enriched by other disciplines. So I picked two posters from the conference there. And the first one here is an example of using genomic epidemiology to look at a pathogen. And basically what the authors did in that work is some very in-depth biological work to describe these isolates. A lot of analysis on the genome, on what antibiotics these isolates were resistant to. So really a lot of detailed microbiological information. And another poster, on the other hand, that has nothing to do with this project is using machine learning to predict the AMR phenotype of a bacteria from genomic data. And now this is a much more computational approach where the authors use data to then parameterize all their model and use that to predict if a bacteria is going to be actually resistant to an antibiotic based on the genes carried by that bacteria. And I think this is an example where these people should really try talking to each other because the poster on the top would, I think, greatly benefit from the approach created by the author at the bottom to sort of go beyond the data that they've collected and gain further insights into their isolates. But inversely, the people from the bottom poster, I'm sure, would be very interested in seeing that very detailed data collected by the authors of the top poster. So this is an example of how these different pieces of work can sort of talk to each other and can be enriched by taking methods from another discipline. So now I'm going to talk a tiny bit about my work specifically to use that as another example of the value of interdisciplinary research, but also to talk about what I think is the biggest challenge when doing that type of work. So as I was saying before, I combine lab work and mathematical modeling to look at the dynamics of bacteria and bacteriophage, so also coded phage. So these are the most abundant organisms on the planet, and they're viruses of bacteria. So they're natural predators of bacteria. But on top of that, there are also major drivers of bacterial evolution through the process of transduction. So that's a type of horizontal gene transfer where the phage are going to move genes between bacteria. And that can lead to significant AMR evolution, but we currently don't have a good understanding of the dynamics of this process. So how fast transduction happens, how it's going to vary depending on the number of phage, number of bacteria, environmental conditions. And this is really the question that I'm interested in. And so as I was saying, I combine lab work and mathematical modeling to do that. So if I had to really sum up all my methods on one slide, this is what it would look like. So I've got the lab set up on the left and the modeling on the right. So the value of doing it this way is that by growing bacteria and phage in the lab and generating data on how they interact, that means that I have very valuable, detailed biological data on this interaction that I can rely on to say, okay, this is what happens when all these organisms are together. The downside of the lab work, on the other hand, is that it's very time consuming. You're not going to be able to observe a lot of conditions because if you want to have an experiment where you change the number of phage in bacteria, then you're going to have to rerun everything. So it's going to take you days. And you are going to be limited as well in what you see. So you're going to be able to count bacteria and phage, but you can't see them interacting in real time. You cannot see these microscopic organisms actually interacting with each other. That's not possible. On the other hand, what the mathematical modeling allows you to do is to represent these interactions between the organisms. So that's what all the arrows are here for. So that means you can sort of see the organisms interacting with each other and really disentangle these dynamics. The downside of modeling is that if you use it on its own, you're going to have to rely on a lot of assumptions, parameter values taken from many, many different sources, and that's not ideal. So that's the value of combining these two things here is the lab data is going to enrich the model by making sure you have robust parameter values for all these interactions. And on the other hand, the modeling is going to enrich the lab work by disentangling all the dynamics that are going on between the organisms in the test tubes. So that's the value here. But what about that major challenge that I mentioned? But I think the major challenge with interdisciplinary work is to be able to explain it and talk about it. So what I mean by this is if you are a microbiologist, and you came to me, and then you wanted me to tell you what I was working on, and I started telling you that I build deterministic compartmental models with system of ordinary differential equations and logistic functions linking phage burst size to bacterial growth. I think you would run away, which is perfectly understandable. But on the other hand, if you're a modeler and coming to me asking the same question, and I told you that I grew Staph aureus bacteria in liquid media, and that I counted bacteria using selective agar with antibiotics and counted phage using agar overlay techniques, then again, you would run away because that's not the correct way to explain these things. So it's really about finding the right way to communicate your work to these different audiences. And the second part of that challenge is, if I only explain the lab work to the microbiologists and the modeling work to mathematical modelers, then these two audiences are missing 50% of the work. The real challenge is then going to be able to talk about the lab work to modelers and talk about the modeling to the microbiology audience. So it's finding ways to do this. That's really the tricky thing with that type of work. So what about some other challenges then? So in the week before, when I was preparing this talk, I did a little poll on Twitter asking people, what do you think is the biggest challenge for interdisciplinary research in AMR? And I gave them a couple of options, and I got another few interesting comments, but I'll just focus on the three major ones. So as you can see, the first one that got the most votes was about money, facilities, and tools, which first of all, I find very encouraging, because to me it suggests that what's missing is not the willingness to do interdisciplinary work, but the resources to do it. So how do we solve this then? And I think the first thing that's important to do there is to communicate the importance of this type of work to the funders, to the institutions, who will then be able to give the resources to researchers to conduct this type of interdisciplinary work. So that's for the first challenge. The second one was about gathering the appropriate skills and the appropriate people to conduct this research. And here I think the solution is really to train people early in interdisciplinary research. So not necessarily to make everyone do interdisciplinary research, but at least for people to be aware of it and to then have the opportunities to do it if it's relevant for their project, if it's relevant for them. And that's really early career researchers, which have a big role to play in this, I think. But that said, I think it's very important to value interdisciplinarity at all stages of scientific careers, because it can happen sometimes that as you're more senior, if you start explaining that you're doing an interdisciplinary project, you and sort of go back to that original point I dismissed about, oh, well, then you know nothing. If you're doing modeling and microbiology, then you're not really a professor of either. You're not a professor of microbiology, and you're not a professor of modeling. You're just knowing a bit of both, but not really a full expert, which, as I said before, isn't true. So I think that's the important thing here for the point on gathering skills in people. Now, the last one was about finding and creating projects, and I actually thought that was the most important point out of the three. And the reason for this is because if you don't do this right, then what can happen very easily is one discipline in a project can be pushed to the side and sort of just ends up as a sort of add-on. So with mathematical modeling, it happens very often that it ends up in the supplementary material of papers, and authors just say, oh, well, we did this as well, and go check out Appendix 16 for the details on that, which I think is a bit of a shame, because that means that you've potentially missed opportunities to really make the most out of these different disciplines that you try to combine. So maybe you missed some insight, some better way to answer the question which you were tackling in this type of project. So I think to solve this, it's very important to design projects with interdisciplinarity in mind from the beginning, to make sure you're really making the most out of these different disciplines you're trying to combine. So overall then, coming back to that original question I asked, is interdisciplinary research the future of AMR science? So hopefully, talking about it here, now you'll agree that it's needed to fill in gaps and answer these big AMR questions. But I actually don't think that the future of AMR science should be 100% interdisciplinary, because you cannot replace the value of work done in single disciplines only. And the reason for that is because it's extremely difficult to try to combine disciplines and individually push them forward at the same time. So what I mean by this is, if you are trying to at the same time invent a novel modeling method which is going to be useful to the entire modeling field, invent a new lab method which is going to be useful to the entire microbiology field, and combine them to answer new questions, it's a lot to try to do at once. It's very complicated, and you might lose sort of focus with that type of project. So what I'm advocating for here essentially is not for the future of AMR science to be 100% interdisciplinary, but for everyone to be aware of what it means to do interdisciplinary work, and to have the opportunities to do that type of work if it's relevant to them and to their project. So to sum things up here, so interdisciplinary work is useful to overcome limitations from single disciplines. And AMR needs that, but again, it cannot replace research in single disciplines. This is still going to be needed in the future. So we've talked about some of the key challenges there, but then ultimately I think the future of interdisciplinary science really relies on the people involved in it. So if you are actually doing some sort of interdisciplinary work, then you should talk about it to as many different audiences as you can. It's going to help to solve some of these key challenges that I flagged there. It's essentially really important to sort of talk about this field. And if you're not doing interdisciplinary science right now, then the only thing I can ask of you is to just be curious. So again, this on the right is these 65 posters and 27 presentations that I was mentioning earlier at this conference. And it's really about, it's really up to you to be curious about these things and go out to explore, go see these posters, attend these talks, attend outside of this, attend webinars, talk to people. So with AMR, you know that if you go to a talk which is on AMR, ultimately the end goal is the same as your own AMR work. It's going to be about solving that problem, finding solutions to that problem, but the approach and the methods are going to be different. So just trust the person speaking to you to know how to explain their research to you, and go learn something, and maybe you'll find that the method that they're using could actually be useful in your own projects. So yeah. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening to this. So I'd also like to thank all the people I work with who make interdisciplinary science so enjoyable. So if you're curious about my work specifically, you can go check out this paper and this preprint, which I was also presenting at this conference. So thank you very much.